All right. Well, we might get into it, everybody. I'm sure a few more people will be tuning in as we progress through the morning. I'm not going to go into too much detail about Nigel and his bio here because it's quite long and extensive with his incredible career that he's had. Just a few highlights. He has had a career spanning almost 40 years as an executive leader in non-profit organisations, most notably, as you probably know, as the CEO of Mater Foundation here in Queensland. And under his leadership at Mater Foundation, annual fundraising revenue grew from 2 million to 70 million, which is raising over 3 to 4 billion over that period, and establishing the foundation as one of the largest health charities and a major funder of medical research and clinical services. He holds an MBA majoring in fundraising, as well as qualifications in public relations and marketing. He's also a certified fundraising executive. And this is where I'm just going on a roll with his incredibly long bio. But what I'm really impressed by him, I haven't had a lot of interactions with him, but just the experiences I have had, you can see that he's just a servant leader to the industry, to our sector, which I'm really pleased to see in his presentation. He'll be touching on leadership and servant leadership. So it's really, it's just a testament to who he is that he would come and share with us today, and just part of that generous spirit that he has. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Nigel. He's going to share for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to dive into our questions. And as I mentioned earlier, if we don't get to all of those questions, Nigel is available for you to contact him as well. So over to you, Nigel. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce, and thanks to everyone for being up about early, particularly if you're from Brisbane. It's an early start, so really appreciate you making the time, and thanks again for the opportunity. So today I'm going to talk about fundraising leadership for around 30 minutes or so, just past a half hour, and then there's a whole bunch of questions that people have identified, and I'm happy to take some others through to 8 this morning. I guess just a couple of things. I'm going to run really quickly through a fair bit of content, not because I just want to speed through it, but I'm keen to leave with you the germ of a number of ideas, some of which you may have seen and heard before. I see Ruth Knight's on the line, so I expect that with a great familiarity with some of the concepts I'm putting out. And I'm certainly going to leave the slides available. They'll be up on my website, which will be coming up in the next week or so, and I'll be happy to distribute them as well. So by that, and please don't spend a lot of time taking down notes, taking photos or whatever, not because I don't want you to, but simply because I'm keen for you to lean into the conversation we're having, and then we can spend some time on questions as well. So the content will be there. So today I'm looking to talk to you about fundraising leadership, which is a topic that I've been looking at for a long time, I guess, in terms of my time in practice. And I want to really take this through 3 phases of the conversation. I want to talk about some leadership concepts that I think are really pertinent to leadership in a fundraising context. I want to introduce you to some research and literature, again, some of which I hope will be familiar, but it's a walk through some of the body of knowledge that I think really ties in a leadership conversation pursuant to fundraising, brings it all together. And I also then want to just take a different turn and talk about a view of personal leadership that I have, and leave you with a bit of a checklist of things that you might look at in terms of your own leadership approach. We'll do that 30 minutes, and then we can have a chat about some of those ideas as well. So to kick off, I'm starting with a quote that I first came across 40 years ago, and it's this quote from Lao Tzu, which I still really love. It's the idea that the leader is best when they step back, and that also means a leader needs to know when they step forward. And the thing I really like about that, and even though it resonated with me before I moved into this, this practice set, the longer I spent in fundraising practice, the more it really occurred to me that our role as a leader in fundraising is not to be at the centre, particularly the centre of attention. We really need to know when, how to influence, but to let those people around that we are serving actually be prominent. And it's a very difficult leadership challenge at times. But Lao Tzu, back in 6 BC, talked about this, and this idea of leadership that I think is very much around knowing when to step back. And it correlated for me with this idea of servant leadership that I came across probably a little over 20 or so years ago now. This idea that was coined by Jim Greenleaf back in 1977, and it's described, some of the key things that really jump out for me is it's about service, it's about a holistic approach, it's about a sense of community and shared decision-making power, and it's about transformation and positive change. And if those words don't actually talk to the very purpose within which we operate, then I'm really not sure what does. And again, when we look at the characteristics of servant leadership, I think those themes, I won't go through them all, really again give great voice to the role in which we take on in fundraising practice, serving philanthropy. I was delighted when I first came across some of Hank Crosso's writing, and Hank Crosso, for those that haven't discovered Hank yet, was really one of the most prominent fundraising teachers and authors. He left us some years ago, but in fact he does have a link with Queenslanders that some of the early work is now being seen through ACP and SQUT, influenced by Hank. And he talks about Greenleaf and servant leadership, from this idea of servant leaders drawing allegiance from others, and again, leading not from power, but from a motivation to serve. And one of the most beautiful pieces of prose that I found Rosso writing was this idea, this invocation to us as fundraisers, as sensitive professionals, not technical practitioners, and the idea that we're reflective in our service, and the idea that servant leadership, the idea of being a servant is not diminishing. I think this is where people get stuck with this. They mistake servile and being a servant, and they're two very different things. But that last question or questions that Hank poses about, am I doing my job right? Am I fulfilling my responsibility? Really are quite central questions for fundraising practice and fundraising practitioners. So it's great that Rosso's writing about it. It's also fantastic that we see this in Peter Drucker's writing, who really is one of the most foremost leadership thinkers in his lifetime. And again, he talks about this idea of a leader really keeping their eye on the task, not themselves, and introduces this idea of being a servant. Jim Collins similarly talks to servant leadership, not necessarily in those words, but his idea of level 5 leadership, this idea of personal humility and professional will. And you may be familiar with Collins' analogy of this window and mirror, that the level 5 leader, when things go well, looks through the window and says, these are the people who have done it. When things don't go well, when things go badly, he looks in the mirror, and that's the person who's responsible. And I think that sense of accountability and ownership, again, it's about building creation and contribution, but it also comes with those really steady results. So no one should ever mistake servant leadership or level 5 leadership as in any way being meek or some soft notion of leadership. And again, Collins' model of level 5 leadership, I won't go into that, but it's easily sourced. And I think one of the themes that really jumps out for me in talking about level 5 or Collins' view of leadership is it's not about the leader, whereas good leaders at level 4 leaders is very much around them. And I think, again, some of Collins' themes, and you've got so many terrific ways of expressing things, but when you look at ideas of clock building, not telling time, changing life of others, finding ways to be useful rather than successful, being interested, not interesting, really talks to the sense of a human focus, which I think is, again, at the core of this leadership domain. And I'm just throwing this in because 20 years ago, I put together a small body of work around looking at how a leadership model worked in fundraising. And this is a bit of a theoretical framework around that concept as well. And again, happy to share that work at a broader scale if anyone's ever interested. So that's just a very quick walk through some of leadership thinking, but happily over the last couple of decades, there's been some terrific work done from a research point of view. And to start with, I just want to touch on some work done by Avi and Sergeant Jen Sheng back in 2012, sponsored by Clayton Burnett at the time. And it looked at fundraising leadership or more over great fundraising was really the question that was being prosecuted. And the idea was, what makes fundraising great? And what were the elements in all of that? And the organisations that were chosen to be studied were those that were peer nominated. In other words, that the sector actually identified as being really good fundraising outfits. And they were studied from the perspective of what lay under the hood, and particularly in terms of the way in which they operated. And the discovery, I think, remains really, really interesting. So they looked at outstanding leadership, and I think, again, so many rich gems here. This idea of outstanding leaders in these great organisations, great fundraising organisations, looked at aligning metrics with long-term drivers of donor value, long-term, and stress this time and time again. Standards and behaviours, value for supporters, again, long-term, and aligning reward systems and appraisal with this longer-term growth. So here we are seeing this, again, this really strong emphasis on the long haul rather than the short-termism that pervades our practice in so many ways. And they talk about structure, and again, fundraising leaders managing upwards, looking at reward systems that encourage cooperation and working with peers across different disciplines, this sense of connection. Looking at learning culture, and again, a bit of a nod here in the broader conversation on philanthropic culture to Ruth's work, but this idea of cultural shift not just happening within the fundraising team, it's across an organisation, challenging assumptions and norms. And again, who leads this? And it really talks to, among others, the CEO as a critical person of influence, and I'll visit some more research that talks about that as well. This notion of outstanding leaders be encouraging flexibility and risk-taking, providing a development focus. And here again, for the second time this morning, we're talking about a different view of failure, redefined as being a failure to learn from experience. Remember, Collins talked about the idea of failure being about, in fact, being substituted by growth rather than thinking about failure. And I think it's really important to think about this sort of liberation that we actually have to be free to explore. That's what good leaders do. Also about looking out as well as looking in. So many times I hear folk in the sector say, I'm too busy to actually engage in the sector. I'm too busy to go and lift my head up. I can tell you that's not a leadership behaviour in any way, shape or form. And again, this research talks about this. This idea of offering personal support and mentoring, encouraging team members to broaden their roles and profession by serving in different functions in areas, learning from others, drawing on best practice and sharing knowledge and experience. So if you are too busy to be a leader, then you probably won't be a leader. And that's a stiff challenge as well. This idea of technical skills, and we'll visit this not for the first time now as well, this ability to think and think clearly about themselves, but to think broadly about the organisation, about the systems, and about creating an environment within which fundraising flourishes. And again, the challenge here, I think, is so often we get focused on the mechanical aspects of fundraising and just look at that singularly, and that really never works effectively. This idea of organisational change and transformation and creating outstanding fundraising success being facilitated through, again, that transformational approach. So again, if you're interested in that study, have a look at it. Sergeant Sheen, great fundraising report. There's another study that's also been done. I'm not going to elaborate on this, just simply to flag it exists, and it's a terrific follow-up study that was really taking great fundraising, which looked at fundraising leadership in organisations, and this then moves to taking a view of board and executive leadership influencing fundraising. And the really neat thing about this was that it was done in Australia, and it was also funded by FIA Foundation and the Mobies, and again, a really terrific report to access. I'm going to jump into a bit of literature just quickly to talk about some of the perspectives of fundraising leadership management from some fundraising authors. Stanley Weinstein talks about fundraising. So again, translate the role of executive fundraiser for a fundraising leader here. Planner, writer, analysis, operations, and a cheerleader. Expert in organisation development. So here again, there's a theme there that comes out in this bigger picture. Hank Russo talks about a teacher. So again, I would argue that our job as a teacher and educator in pedagogy really is important in leadership and fundraising. leader, planner, communicator, cheerleader again, activist, boundary spanner, bouncer of multiple balls. So Hank's really talking to this breadth of view that we have to take in fundraising leadership. I love Kay Grace's work around this idea of multidisciplinary function, psychology, sociology, anthropology, history. This plays to me personally. I'm a history nerd, and love the study of people. And I think that really talks to, again, the profession that we're in economics. And I think they balance some of the more obvious disciplines, public relations, marketing, accounting, and management. And here again, I think that, so often I've been asked over the years, if you're in fundraising, ain't you an accountant? And I'm going to argue, if that's all you look at fundraising through an accounting lens, that you're never really going to understand the craft at all. Economics different, mathematics different, but I love the idea of social behaviour, psychology, anthropology informing what we do. Simone Joyo really again comes back to this challenge of fundraising problems being organisational issues. In fact, she's positing 75% of it. So she's really talking about the blend of fundraising technician, organisation development specialist. And so we see this theme in the Great Fundraising Report. We see Weinstein talking about this, and Simone's talking about this as well. And she's talking about the accomplished fundraiser, again, reaching out, participating in governance, organisational-wide strategy, evaluation, being a systems thinker, identifying relevant information inside and outside the organisation. And she talks about the you piece as well, and she's really got some stiff challenges in terms of your own commitment, your will, and your assertiveness. And let's not mistake assertiveness for aggression or for pushing people out the way. It's that steely will and resolve that Collins talks about again. But you've got to do something as a leader and be an accomplished fundraiser. Another great piece of research that was done in 2013 through QUT, ACP&S, Wendy Scaife, Alex Williamson and Katie McDonald, Who's Asking for What. I won't have time to do this research justice. I really hope there's some folk among us that have already accessed this. And I'm just going to really cherry pick a couple of things that I think are important in terms of the conversation this morning. Looking at the Australian non-profit landscape, and remember this is 13, organisations thinking differently, developing fresh skills, looking to enter the fundraising market, this question of rising competition. Now, look, I have a view that actually we don't really compete in a technical sense, but we are in a busy, crowded, noisy market, and that continues to be so. This idea of fundraising turnover, this report and the Compass Point report around the same time identified sort of 16 to 18 month turnover. Last year, the Chronicle of Philanthropy published the Harris poll, nothing to do with me, and again affirmed an 18 month turnover in fundraising. That's a real problem. It's a massive issue, and I think there's a real blight, I think, on management and leadership that this is enabled. It continues to be allowed to happen. So anyway, back to the study, it talks about the new reality affecting board CEOs and fundraisers. And the thing I really find, again, a little jarring about this was 2013, it was nearly a decade ago, and we're still dealing with the same issues in 2020 writ large now. So I just have to challenge leadership at every level. What are we really doing in response to problems that are very obvious and challenges that are before us now? Two great challenges relating to board engagement, lack of board understanding and leadership in fundraising, and lack of resourcing to undertake successful fundraising. Now, I've heard fundraisers for decades talk about boards don't understand me, they don't support, they don't lead. And look, there's a whole conversation around why this might be so. And there's a terrific question that's been posed, and I might be able to then sort of get that into a bit more detail. In fact, Bruce, it's your question about upskilling board members, which I will come back to. But there is a real challenge for us in terms of how we think about supporting this role of board in the fundraising practice. But there's a challenge for board members, folk in governance roles as well. Again, if this is the remit of your organisation, if this is the scope of your responsibilities, and you don't understand the business that you're in, then there is a serious question around being fit for purpose in terms of your responsibilities as a director. And it doesn't mean that every director has to be an expert in this area. It helps having someone on a board that is, and I found that to be very useful myself as a board member, but also it can be a role of executive leadership to help upskill a board in that regard as well. So it can be supported in many ways. But fundamentally, this is a major blocker, and this lack of understanding and this lack of resourcing continues, I would argue, to impede best possible outcomes for social purpose. It impedes effectiveness, and bizarrely, it actually impedes efficiency. And the very metrics we return to think about measuring efficiency, and I will come to this because I've another great question around that as well, actually are counterintuitively wrong. So let's talk more about that. This question or key recommendation, the importance of the CEO in fundraising, again, really placing the CEO at the centre of influence in terms of fundraising success. So communicating strongly with board, championing fundraising, resourcing, again, study recommending the idea of investing, training. I remember a director, Paul Murnane, many years ago at a session we were both involved in presenting, really talking about the idea of if the CEO isn't comfortable or interested in fundraising, yet that's the remit of their organisation. In his words, they should actually get out the way, leave, and let someone who actually is prepared to take on the job take it on. They were pretty challenging words, but I loved hearing them because I think that was really the sort of stiff challenge we need. But again, this has to actually be born of deep understanding, or a deep enough understanding to do your job. I see often superficial understanding being played out as being a substitute for I know because I think I know, I have a particular set of views, and that always doesn't cut the mustard either. So I've walked you through, I said it would be quick, and again, we can open that far more broadly. There's some other great work. My long-term friend and buddy Margaret Scott's been doing some terrific work in that area and continues to do it, and I can keep on going more broadly around leadership. But I just wanted to leave with you some significant elements in the body of knowledge around research and literature that actually frames these ideas and drew in those leadership frameworks I touched on before, because they do have a really significant synergy. So that's talking about leadership in a fundraising context broadly. I now want to swing the conversation to you, the leader in fundraising. And there are 6 elements that I've identified that I think are really important. 3 foundational elements, and they have a really important order. So the first 3 are very much in order. The second 3 are more about how you operate and how you are, and they can be assembled any way you like. So these are my 3 R's plus 3 R's of fundraising leadership. And the first and the most important, I'll argue, is relevance. And you have to be relevant. If I tell a story that revolves around a very dear friend of mine, Sister Angela Mary, who was the person who brought me to Martyr, and one of my greatest mentors in work and in life. And I remember I worked alongside of Sister Angela Mary for a number of years. She retired out of a working role somewhere perhaps in the late 1990s, early 2000s. We didn't have as many conversations as we used to have. And one day I ran across her at Martyr, and she said to me, almost in hushed tones, and she was never one to actually sort of speak harshly or admonishingly, but she was almost in that mode in this particular conversation. She said to me, Nigel, you need to be sure that Martyr Foundation is relevant and that you're relevant. And I wasn't quite sure what she was talking about, but we were having some challenges at the time. And I reflected on this, and she was really giving me in the most gentle but clear fashion a very, very strong challenge. And that was to make the organisation relevant within its remit, but to make sure that I, as a leader, was relevant in what I did in my work as well. I've never forgotten that. And I look at this question of relevance and leadership, and again, literature tells us as a leader you need to matter, you need to be, your ability to create results is dependent on relevance. So I'll come to results later, but again, relevance is that central hub. And leaders need to stay and be agile, relevant. Agile leaders need to stay and be relevant. So again, you need to keep challenging yourself, unfreezing yourself in that quest for relevance. This idea of how you are relevant, reading, be a student of the world, be interested, as Collins challenges us, understand what's happening around you for your market and the people in it, and be innovative and creative. And that doesn't necessarily mean in every form and fashion, but challenge yourself to keep thinking. And staying relevant is hard. Again, literature tells us, and experience tells us exactly the same thing. It's something that takes real effort and work. And this idea of relevance is rooted in change and growth and paying attention. I have to say, if I reflect on my time at a foundation, It wasn't the same story over and over. It was constantly being challenged, and being challenged often in some massive ways, and continuing to change and grow in that continuous improvement. But the important part here too is you've got to look after yourself, mentally, physically, and emotionally. You can't create a leadership platform based around relevance if you don't take care of yourself. And that is just so important in all of this. And we see this play out in 2020 particularly. The second area I just want to touch on is relationships. And it might seem obvious and even soft and cuddly, but we are in a relationship business. Everything we do forms and is informed by relationships. So this is pivotal, and it's my second most important R. So it's the next step away from you and relevance and what you're doing being relevant. The folk in the photograph, some might recognise the fellow with the pink tie, younger version of me. The lady in the purplish jacket, Peter McGrath, friend, a very dear friend, someone who was on the Mother Foundation board when I joined, and really the prime mover in fundraising. And I know at the time when I started, he probably thought I was the devil incarnate. More professional fundraisers had horns and tails tucked away somewhere. And we needed to find a way to form a relationship. And it was a kind of a formidable character, I guess. And anyway, over time, and happily not too long a period of time, we did. And so many of my years of motive were spent with Betty being both my fiercest critic to me, but moreover my staunchest advocate and defender. And I think that sense of shift that could have gone any particular way was something that was really about investing in relationships. And one of the things that I treasure most fondly around my time at a wonderful institution. The man with the red tie, John O'Donnell, was the leader of Mater Health for nearly 14 years. And again, someone who was very focused in his leadership, very challenging. And I remember in John's early time, I should say, at Mater, he presented with some stiff challenges around the role of my foundation, where we were heading, what we were doing. And happily, well, yeah, I've got a minute or so, I can tell the story. We were in John's office one day when he presented me with a letter. It was a 12-point letter that was identifying the things that he was planning to share with the board of the foundation about challenges or problems he saw. So my response, very quickly, was to think on my feet, I guess, or on my tail as it happened, and walk through point by point each of those issues. At the end of our conversation, John picked up the letter, tore it into small pieces and put it in the bin. And I think that his willingness to actually hear, to understand and to respond in a way that wasn't about him was singularly impressive. He also became one of the most significant defenders and promoters of philanthropy, someone that I really believe understood it. And we were only talking about this a couple of weeks ago when we were having a coffee, and very generously puts that down to, I guess, the influence in working with me, which I'd say is very generous. But he was an influencer and a shaper, and a very important relationship as well. One that wasn't without its challenges, but we remain friends, which is fabulous in that context. So again, in terms of relationships, Keating talks about authentic leaders, building real relationships with people, making that one of their top priorities, being intentional and scheduling time. Morrison talking about the world not being made up of things, being made up of relationships. And we achieve results primarily through relationships. It goes right back to Later in this idea of us leading through people. The minute we lose ourselves in this idea that we can do it all ourselves, we've lost the leadership community. It is about the relationship. And again, recognizing that most relationships don't form fast. And Carnegie reminds us that we're dealing with people, we're dealing with creatures of emotion, of logic. And Enrico talks about this idea that the hard stuff, the soft stuff is always harder than the hard stuff, and yet we often focus on the hard stuff as being in some way primary. The third R is results. And again, you might think, why isn't that the first? After all, results matter, but I'm going to really contend, and even some of the things that I've shared already, talk to the idea that without relevance and without relationships, you just don't have a platform to get results. But you need to affect results as a leader. Daniel Goleman talks about what leaders should do, and again, to get results. I love the quote from Friedrich Nietzsche talking about the most common form of human stupidity being forgetting what they're there to accomplish. And Harvard Business School lecturer Dutch Leonard talks about the job of a leader being to remind people what's there, we're there to accomplish for the results. And again, naming a result, the idea of articulating a result, what success looks like as a common goal is terribly important. If we all have a different view, a version of results, we'll never be successful. And again, Goleman talks about this idea, as he would, emotional intelligence being a framework for achieving results, and this idea of context and expectations, measurement, reporting also key to managing results. So there are top 3 R's: relevance, relationship, and results. I want to then bring you to the next 3. And the first is resilience. So 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago, I was part of a fundraising trek through the Andes, walking the Inca Trail. I did it with my son Lachlan, which is fabulous, but it was a tough walk, and we were at 4,215 metres actually was where we got to. But in our group, there's a guy named Dave, and Dave, toward the end of the trip, was struggling a bit. Dave was a few years younger than me, and you could see that in the last day or so, he was really labouring, and it was really tough going for him physically. But he was really, just dug in and was resilient and kept on this, because this is a real bucket list thing for Dave to do, this trip. A year or 2 later, we found out Dave was a really private guy, but it came known that Dave actually had motor neurone disease. And this was really his last big thing that he could do before this disease took hold. Dave passed away a couple of years ago now, but I think about resilience in what was a tough exercise, and Dave comes to mind vividly in that context. But yet resilience is often overlooked in a leadership competence. We tend to skip past it for some reason. And yet at the same time, we look within what leaders do, and we see this question of this notion of resilience. So resilient leaders need to regularly re-energise, again, this taking care of self, be creating positive leadership environments, optimism, quick to blunt setbacks. This is really important as well. Resilient leaders will get knocked down. We all will. You need to get up again, but you also need to set a tone of positivity around you as well. And believe me, what a leader does influences the people around you, whether you realise it or not. And resilient leaders build strong networks and alliances. Again, we come back to relationship, are open-minded, they see patterns, and they watch their mouth. They really need to be careful what they say and how they say. Respect. Again, something we can often move past. Again, I would suggest that in order to be respected, to get respect, you have to give respect. So this idea of respect being an action, seen as an action that's possible to create a culture. It's about the way in which we work naturally and authentically, and that being real. And Lao Tzu has a wonderful way of looking at respect in terms of challenging us not to compare ourselves with other people. If you take that pressure off, you can actually be comfortable in your own skin. And it's interesting as to how respect gathers around you in that context as well. Again, respectful environment, respectful interactions empower people, more engaged, healthier, more productive. So we're often, again, challenged to think about leadership in being strong and demanding and challenging and forceful. But this is not what we're saying here in terms of respect. And again, it comes right back to the servant leadership notion. And it's the core to relationships and driving esteem. And there's an interesting conversation I see emerging in fundraising around well-being of the fundraiser, well-being of the donor. And I think 2020 is not a year about thinking about well-being. That again, we've probably been under a rock. So I think it's important. And respect relating to trust. In this sector, we have a commodity of trust and confidence, and respect is a pathway to that. So the last of the R's is reflection. And here again, I'm talking about this idea of stepping back, observing, noting what's happening, looking for patterns, meaning, thought process, intuition, It's this idea of self-reflection, looking inside yourself, increased self-awareness, emotional intelligence, as Goldman reminds us, about mindfulness, about finding that introspective practice as well, looking inside yourself as well. That's not a soft, inactive approach to leadership. And the idea of critical thinking, I really do challenge or worry at times that in fundraising practice, we don't have an intellectual curiosity. I think we need to really be quite disciplined around this and seek and question information, and that as a basis for the way in which we operate, rather than just accepting things on them. So there are my 3+3 R's: relevance, relationships, and results, and underpinned by how we might be around resilience, respect, and reflection. And with that, we've looked at 3 things, as I touched on: leadership concepts, research and literature, and a body of knowledge, and a personal framework that you might think and act on. And now it's over to you. So let's have some questions.
Excellent. That was great, Nigel. I think we'd all agree that Nigel's definitely relevant with the amount of memes that he put in his slideshow with Austin Powers and Toy Story. So great to see you living out what you're preaching there. So we've got some questions this morning. I'm going to do them in chronological order of how they came through to me. And as I said, if we don't get through them all today, Nigel's generous enough to have you contact him about your questions. So the first one this morning, some of these may have already been answered, but Nigel, you can feel free to sort of add anything to these if you feel. So first one's from Erin McCabe. What sort of skills would you recommend to mid-level fundraising leaders for development? This might be overarching skill sets, specific study areas, or even courses.
Yep. So I guess a lot of what I've covered already this morning, I hope touches on some of the answers to that question, Erin, and I'm happy to extrapolate that out a bit further. But I think among the fundamentals for me, knowledge is important. To have sight of and carriage of the body of knowledge, not all of it clearly, but to understand there is a body of knowledge is important, critical, absolutely. Fundraising has to be a practice founded on what you know, just not what you think and see and make assumptions about. And that does challenge us to spend more time around literature and research, not in a passive way, but translating that back into practice. I think the idea of framing, if we talk about skills and study, I'll sort of bring that together. Continuing professional education development is critical, as is more formal study, and whether it's study that is framing or specific to the sector. Of course, you can't go and do an undergraduate degree in fundraising, but you can do some great postgraduate work, including at ACPNS and QUT, so I would certainly commend that. Practice credentialing is really important. We have this really strange community in the sector about whether we need it or not. I think it's a no-brainer, quite frankly, and it's interesting to see the UK introduce a version of that as well in the last 12 months or so too. All that does really is give you an affirmation that you understand and your confirmation objectively that the body of knowledge is confirmed, but it also challenges you to keep it up to date constantly, which is a terribly important professional tenet. And I think that, again, you can look in other disciplines and areas of practice that relate to what you do. That's terribly important. But I think it is really time for us to step up as a practice and as a profession. I've heard for decades now fundraisers lament they don't get taken seriously, but I've also seen us not do enough to actually change that paradigm and do the things that not just create the marks, they're terribly important, but actually evidence the knowledge. And I think that almost sort of points to a collective weakness in that we just don't have that shared paradigm, which means those who might assume to know about fundraising perhaps have a greater station than is necessarily reasonable. So again, I think that I covered off many of the attributes that I would see. Beth Breeze, has a researcher in the UK, has also some great insights. I would suggest you Google some of Beth's work as well. But I hope that goes some way to answering the question.
Excellent, thanks, Nigel. Next one's from Dr. Ruth Knight from QUT. Her question is, what should you report about how much it costs to raise money?
Ruth, thanks so much for the question. The first thing I would say is report the truth, which is not a percentage or a number. It's not a moment in time. In other words, every time we would try to reduce it to a singular quantitative measurement, not only are we wrong, but we're actually being misleading and damaging, I would argue. You know, I defy anyone to actually give me a cogent description of what's happening in a fundraising construct based on a single view of a percentage or number. It cannot be done under any circumstances. So this sector has to stop talking about numbers that actually don't matter and start measuring the things that we do. So part of our challenge has been we've not also been particularly good coming together in a common way around that, both in terms of how we measure inside and even from a comparative point of view, which is actually just barking mad, quite frankly, in a simple metric sense. So it is a critical conversation. It's one that impedes outcomes, and I would say that generally as a sector, as we've said, we're really poor at responding. But there is an answer. Again, I shared with the group last week, Bruce was amongst it, one of the models I have, a 4-dimensional measurement model, which talks about measuring time, measuring programs, as fundraising programs, measuring relationships and supporters, and measuring finance, I should say, first, and lastly, measuring time. So here I think about things in a far broader view. So finance, programs, relationships and time as being a measurement construct. I have a benchmarking model which actually is broken down by programs, broken down by ranges of broadly suggested frameworks across different programs. Critically, again, it looks at time, so the movement of performance over time, so you can understand, for example, where investment might lie to get a return in a few years' time. So that's a useful model. Board Source's model of cost and dependency is a ripper. It looks at the comparison between costs across different programs and dependency and this inverse relationship. So I think, again, there are models out there, and one of the challenges for us in the sector, we do need to build far more collective agreement around the sector, around what is and what isn't. I was in a workshop a few years ago now where really clever people in the sector were tasked to come to find a fundraising cost percentage in the same set of finances, and they came back with 3 widely different answers. And so, you know, it's simply, there are no accounting standards in fundraising practice in Australia. You know, there's terrific research that actually affirms all of this. Stop doing it, start substituting real arguments around measurement, which include financial quantitative, non-financial quantitative, and qualitative metrics.
Excellent. Thanks, Nigel. That was great. I think we could talk all day about that one, especially you and Ruth. The next question comes from myself. What do you think would be the best way to inform or upskill a board or board members that have no fundraising knowledge or experience and are hesitant to invest in fundraising?
I've got a few thoughts here, Bruce, and again, all of these things work together. Perhaps the last is the most important, though. Firstly, use knowledge and evidence, not emotion. Not to inform about fundraising. Certainly emotion is good in terms of understanding outcomes, but knowledge and evidence. Measurement that informs. So again, harken back to what I've just talked about in terms of measurement. Strategic framing and referencing against purpose. Again, being able to understand where we're heading and getting common agreement around that. Results are critical. I mean, you can't just keep promising an outcome and never delivering. Consistent, defendable messaging. This is critical as well. So keep telling a story over and over and over again. Proximity is really important again. I found that when I've had proximity to the board, I've worked with the board, many board members over a long time, for many years, and that shared sense of conversation and the other points I've just mentioned were really important and all of that. And yet where I've not had proximity to folk in governance roles, it's been much harder inside an organisation to get that message across. Trust, and to be trusted. You know, I think that's really a critical factor, and this is a real challenge in organisations generally, is this sense of not just creating trust, but how we as leaders actually create this idea of that we trust others as well. The last piece, sorry, for fundraisers particularly say, my board doesn't understand and doesn't get it. You've got to learn how to speak board. Stop talking fundraising. You've got to speak the language of boards in order to have a conversation with board.
That's great. Next question is from Peter Kopp, and then there's also one from Tori that is sort of just around COVID-19. So I'll just put them together. How should leaders be adapting nonprofit teams to manage a post-COVID major recession environment? And what do you think the long-term outcome for fundraising will be from the COVID pandemic?
Sure. Look, I'll tackle Peter's question, which is the leader adaptation question, and the long-term question from Tori. Look, I'll start again. Another model that I've created that I like to use is my 4M model, which looks at market, mission, model, and margin. And here I'm saying that I think, in my observation, a lot of organisations focus first on their mission or their business model, in what they do and how they generate revenue, or their margin. And I'm arguing that all things actually stem from market. So this idea of clarity around market is critical all the time, and it's critical right now and where we're heading into the future. So I think being very market focused against then your organisational framework, I think plan on investing in the long term and measure accordingly is really critical now. And create longitudinal support or engagement if you haven't already. But if you have already and you think you're doing a good job, challenge yourself on that, look at dialing it up. And again, tasking people in your team to build and maintain relationships. Again, I talk about measurement there. But also be realistic. I've already heard some really crazy goals put out by organisations. I don't know whether that's just chewing the breeze or not, but frankly, any organisation thinks they continue to grow rapidly in the current environment is either tapping a really significant vein or is on something. And so we have to be quite realistic about where we are heading right now and what is ahead of us, and I will contend economically and socially the worst is still probably to come. So that's important. Develop people, capability and capacity is critical as well. So they're all things that I would look to in terms of leadership responsibilities. Again, we can talk on from that. To Tori's question around long-term outcome for fundraising, again, I wish I had a crystal ball, but I actually think in some ways the longer-term view is easy to talk about from the short to medium-term view. The way I see it, fundraising serves philanthropy. Philanthropy is about the human condition, and I always remain confident about humanity and the human condition in terms of where we land with that. And so, to that end, I think that we can be confident. And I see that. I was reading a report yesterday coming out of the US that actually talked to some perspectives of 20 really experienced fundraising leaders in the US. And again, they were really talking quite a positive view of the future as well. But I do think there are some challenges for us in how we change in fundraising at a practice level. Professionalism, I've touched on at management level, leadership and governance level. These are still present challenges, and I think they've just got a whole lot tougher and more necessary for us. I think we need to start treating our donors much better, and we need to really understand that donors aren't some sort of ATM, and that's a challenge for us short and long term. As much as I say I've got confidence in humanity, I'm also equally confident if we don't actually engage people on their terms, they have every right and reason, and we should never be surprised they tell us to nick off as organisations and just support those that really do truly love them and engage them.
Excellent. I'm just going to jump to Marta's question now. What would you say is beneficial to progressing a fundraising career? Being across all aspects of the industry or specialising in one type of fundraising? So it's sort of a question of, is it best to be across all the aspects or just sort of specialise?
Yeah, look, again, believe it or not, I'm old enough to have come from a time where there was no such thing as specialisation in fundraising, and that makes me really old. But anyway, that said, look, I think it depends on what you want to do. I think for a career, though, if you're really going to build a career of fundraising, you do need to take a broader view, and I think that having an understanding of a holistic approach. I would argue that actually all fundraising is really the same. So this idea of deep specialisation being in some way different from other specialisations is challengeable in my view, in my perspective. That said, obviously, you know, I watch folk in different parts of practice, and they know stuff that I'll never understand in the deeper way of operating. So again, if you want to focus in an area that you particularly love and understand well, terrific, do that. But I think understanding where the parts fit in the whole is terribly important. So even if you have a deep specialisation, I would strongly, strongly urge never to do that at the cost of understanding the whole as well and where you fit, because you can't be relevant without that understanding.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. Got a few more here. We do have one from Bjorn from Berlin. I'm not sure if he's tuned in, but it's still a good question either way. Do you think it's a good idea to distinguish project-based funding, one-time income streams for a limited time, and business models, that is repeatable and scalable income streams? What should one focus on at which stage? How do you balance both?
Yeah. I think it really depends on your mission in the market, quite frankly. And I think that some organisations are more geared to project focus and others to longitudinal focus, and some both. You know, for example, you can't take a project, I don't think you can take a project focused approach to funding research. Research is a longitudinal game, and it's one that has so many different hooks and crannies that it's really quite difficult to be complete and holistic. That said, of course, we're seeing a whole range of projects being taken to market to fund different elements of COVID vaccine research, but you know, they really are pieces of a bigger whole, and this is an exceptional time. So I think it does depend. Again, it's the focus here really, I think, is about your purpose as an organisation and what you're trying to accomplish. Now, the critical piece to this question really is continuing to remind us that taking a program first approach rather than looking at purpose and market is always going to be a bit backward. I think, I mean back to front probably is a better way to describe that. So I think that really understanding what the nature of the organisation is, what your focus is, and how you pair your fundraising approach to that is the important way to look forward.
Excellent. And another question from Bjorn is, I often witness that nonprofits focus more on donors' needs and wants because that's what brings the money in, and less on the ultimate beneficiary's needs, which isn't healthy in the long run. What do you think? How can one ensure that the dynamic within an organisation balances both groups?
This is a fabulous question because it's a very live conversation internationally, and one that's quite hot, I would say. It's this conversation between what's framed as community-focused fundraising and donor-centric fundraising. And I'm watching it with complete fascination because I see an absolutism emerge about it. You're either this way or that way. And I'm not a great fan of being absolute because I'm a bit of a shades of grey guy, I guess, in this respect. So I think that there does need to be a distinction between an authentic donor-based conversation, one that's very much around responding to donor needs, and one that I would argue that's a little more faux, and that is the organisation constructing its conversation almost a little disingenuously to respond to things that they think that donors might be interested in because it serves their purposes. So there's a distinction I will draw between that. You know, the challenge with that beneficiary or community focus is that in some areas it is difficult to really tap into more than others. So that's a balancing act, again, from a sheer economic perspective, demand and supply. You know, the donor side is the supply side. So if you're not actually talking to the supply side, you don't actually be able to respond to the demand. So just sort of being pure about the demand side is lovely, but it doesn't actually take us anywhere again. So all of this, I think, is a far more complex conversation than even the current debate that's playing out internationally is sometimes giving voice to. And I think we have to think in a more complex and complete way about it. But it's a terrific question to examine. Excellent.
I've got a question here from Dan Joy. It's around, it's a book question. What is your favourite book on systems thinking?
Probably a couple of things. A go-to book for me is Peter Sengi's Fifth Discipline. It's really a seminal books around systems thinking. So, and there's lots and lots of books out there. But another one I'd suggest is, and this is biased because it's a mate of mine who's written it. There's a book called Giving Hope. It came out a year or so ago. It's written by Peter Dalton and Robinson Rowe. And I've got to know Rob as well. Peter's an old friend of mine. I'm looking at Peter Koppel on the screen. I think I know Peter as well. But it looks at a systems approach in a fundraising context, and it's a terrific read. It's very applicable, and there's some great case studies in there, and one of them is the organisation I used to be at. So Giving Hope is an Australian book and well worth a read as well.
Great, that's excellent. Great. I also recommend The Fifth Discipline. It's a great book. Got a question from Jim Green. I think we're able to squeeze this one in, one more. He just wanted to ask your thoughts on creating a culture of feedback within an organisation and how to best go about that. Thinking specifically about the value he placed on reflection and the importance of analysing your own performance, but also your own behaviours and core values.
Great question, Jim, and terrific one to sort of try and condense into a couple of minutes response. Look, a lot of the themes I've raised today, particularly in those sort of personal leadership dimensions, talk to this, I believe, as well as this broader idea of servant leadership and how we frame ourselves. So, I talked before about creating an environment of trust and framing these ideas of trust. I think that is one of the precursors to good feedback environment. So creating a place where people feel trusted, that is very much a leadership responsibility, I would argue, in not just saying the words, but following up with the action, so that people's sense of confidence in being able to articulate all that they may is enabled. I think we also have a responsibility in our roles to be sure that the feedback we offer is constructive and deliberate and going to take us somewhere, and accepting the fact we're emotional creatures, as we touched on earlier. So from time to time, we're not going to be at our finest and we're going to be emotionally led. So we're allowed to get it wrong, get it different from time to time as well. But I think generally, let's be quite clear, and let's also be quite clear where the feedback is coming from. When anyone ever talks about, they said, or I'm speaking on behalf of, or whatever, let's actually get real. They means you. Speaking on behalf of a friend is you. Speaking on behalf of someone else is you. So let's actually just cut the crap and actually talk about what you actually want to jump into. But creating an environment where people feel trusted, I think, is a really important tenet for good feedback loops.
Excellent. The last question I do have is quite a broad one, so I don't expect a comprehensive answer. It's probably more just a direction of where to look for this information, maybe. So just an idea of the different fundraising options with indications of return.
Yeah, look, I touched a little bit on this in some of my comments around measurement models and the board source model again. The best you can do in terms of broad indicators, I look at some of the AFP, Association of Fundraising Professionals guidelines, but they're 20, 30 years old. The same with Jim Greenfield's work, seminal, but long term. Returns with any program are highly variable depending on cause, location, scale of focus, maturity of program, etc. So there is you can't sort of say, it's 10% for campaigns, 50% for events. They're really big rules of thumb. So I think it's a dangerous practice for us to get into to think specifically about a number. A range is acceptable, I would argue. It's an even more dangerous practice to impose that number over a suite of programs as well. In fact, that's just crazy. So I think being mindful around how you might use those numbers, and again, I'm happy to give some more guidance and direction. But one thing I would say, it's not really pursuant to the question, but for goodness sake, stop comparing ourselves against other organisations in a numerical financial way. It cannot be done, ever. So don't do it.
That's brilliant. That's great. I think we have achieved the impossible here this morning, Nigel. We've gotten through all of our questions. It's just turned 8 o'clock. I'd love to sit and chat with all of you all morning, but we've got jobs and just want to respect everyone's time. But as I've mentioned, Nigel is very generous in spirit and is willing to have any more questions, send his way. If you go to nigelharris.com.au, you can send him your questions. I'm sure he'd love to connect with you. But thank you, Nigel, for your time this morning. There is so much to chew on, and our video of recording of this morning is going to be a valuable resource for everyone. I think we probably need to watch it a few times to pick up all the little nuggets that you shared this morning. So thank you again, and looking forward to connecting with all of you in our next meetup. We've only got a few months left of the year, so keep an eye out on our website and through the Meetup app. Nigel, thank you again. What you've done this morning is really given everyone regardless of their experience in fundraising, a real good overview of what's next, what the next step is, and just some real solid leadership and both the soft and the hard skills that you talked about. So that was just fantastic. Thank you everyone for coming. We will sign off here just because it is time for some of us to head to work, but thank you again and hope to see you soon, everybody.
Thanks, Bruce. If I can just say, if you go to my website, it's not active for another week or so yet, but you will find my email address and my phone number. So email, call, folks with LinkedIn, whatever. Really happy to chat. Thanks again, Bruce. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Nigel. Thanks everybody. And yeah, if you just go to digitalforgood.com.au and just add your email address to our email list there, we'll make sure that you get the slides to Nigel's website